My name is Sharday. I'm one of the librarians here at SFCC. I am joined by Heather Morgan, who is my co-pilot librarian. And then we also have another librarian here today, but I won't call on you, Mary. I won't put you on the spot. So this is our first workshop in a series of workshops this quarter called Become a Google Expert. And the focus of this particular workshop is advanced Google searching. So we're going to focus on what sometimes we librarians refer to as like regular Google, making the most of that. We're going to be discussing how Google works, strategies for interpreting your search results, and then also very specifically how to use the advanced Google search feature. Is there anything you wanted to add to that, Heather?
No, I think just to reiterate, it's not just about the Google Advanced Search page. It's more about how to use Google, as Sharday said, regular Google, better.
And our hope is that you can take away some tips and techniques, some strategies that are going to make Googling, specifically Googling from a research perspective, related to your class assignments, a little easier. So obviously we've all been using Zoom for years now. I do like to let you know that anything that is said, we do have transcriptions on, and we'll be using the chat box. That does mean it will be recorded and saved somewhere. I'm not going to do anything with it. But I always like to let you know that that's a thing that's happening. At the end, we will have an evaluation form. So if you're attending for extra credit, that's where you're going to fill out your information. We will contact your instructor and let them know that you attended. You're not required to have your video on during this process, but we do ask that you interact with us. There'll be some poll questions. We might stop and say like, hey, do you guys have some thoughts on this? And there's also an assessment question at the end, just to make sure you're with us, you're engaged, and that hopefully you haven't just like turned on Zoom and walked away. So there is an element of engagement here we hope to have with you. And then I already talked about the assessment and eval part. I always do this. I always get ahead of myself.
I do want to reiterate that though, because sometimes students will attend and forget to actually fill out the feedback form, and then they realize they haven't gotten credit with their instructor because we don't have a way to verify that you are here. So if you think you might have an instructor that wants to know that you've attended, make sure you fill out that form at the end.
Even if you don't know, I'll still send them an email, and it's between you and them if you get that extra credit, but at least I've sent it, so you have the proof. And this quarter, this is our second quarter, where if you attend 3 of the 5 workshops, you will get a certificate or a badge at the end. So some instructors are collecting those specifically. Depends on your instructor. Now, we have a little kind of, not even just caveat, but perspective that we're approaching this workshop from. And that's that, yes, we're doing research. You can obviously use Google to do so many things, but we are coming at this from the perspective of using Google to do academic research for your college courses. However, these techniques and tools could be applied to whatever you want to research on Google. So we're kind of playing double duty there, but that's what all our examples are going to kind of be from today. And then please know that Heather will be monitoring the chats. So if you have some questions, feel free and put that into the chat box, and she'll be paying attention to that. So like I said, we're co-pilots. You guys. So we do want to kind of frame this within the perspective of when to use Google for something like a college assignment. And I don't mean to put you on the spot, Heather, but I know this is something that you've thought about a bit. Sure. Did you want to go over this?
Yes. So obviously we use Google in, personal lives a lot, right? We're always Googling things to find out information or buy things, etc. And sometimes I know people come with this idea that they shouldn't be using Google for school. That might be something that they've heard from teachers in the past, or, something to that effect. But Google is very appropriate for many college assignments or for any type of research in an academic or personal sense. And so these are some times when I would highly recommend using Google. For instance, pre-searching. And what that means is when you are learning more about your topic, maybe your teacher has said, hey, you're going to write a paper on genetically modified food. Well, maybe you don't know a lot about genetically modified food and you just need to kind of get, an overview. You need to learn a little bit more about that. Google's great for that. Just send something out. Also, when you want to find information in a variety of formats, sometimes I know Sharday loves to listen to podcasts, and if you're trying to find a podcast associated with your research topic, Google's a great place for that. Videos the same way, or maybe charts, all sorts of other formats beside just written word. And also local information. A lot of local information is available through Google that you might not find in databases or might be really difficult to find in book form. And there's a lot of information that is just not easily found in some other library resources, such as government reports or information coming from professional organizations, perhaps advisory groups, things like that. So these are the times where you definitely want to use Google. And what this presentation is going to help you maybe be able to find more credible information for your academic reports. So don't overlook Google. It can be an incredible resource for you.
Thank you, Heather. So the example we're going to be using today is based off of something that I'm personally interested in. So I'm coming from the perspective, whenever we come to your classes and to encourage you to research, we always say, pick something that is interesting to you because you're going to be spending a little bit of time with it. And one of the things that I personally find very interesting is con artists and the psychology behind cons. Literally everything on the screen is a book I've read, a podcast I've listened to, or a documentary I've watched. I didn't even realize until I put the stuff on here that I'm in deep. Not to say that I want to be conned. I do not. But I do think the psychology behind it is very interesting. And I've spent quite a bit of time just engaging with these things. So let's say I've had an opportunity with a research assignment where I get to pick the topic. I think this is the topic that I would pick. And so this is the example we're going to be using today as we Google. So we got our basic Google, and I might start with something as simple as the psychology of con artists. Now, as we move throughout this presentation today, know that we're going to have tips along the way. And that's going to be part of the assessment at the end. So it might be easiest for you now as we come up with tips. If you just want to write it down, that will be part of the eval form at the end. So our tip number one is just to stop and strategize, to be intentional, especially when you're approaching this from the perspective of doing research for something like an assignment. And that's pretty much a lot of what the tips are coming after this are going to be encouraging you to do. It's strategies for taking a moment and really engaging with the resources and being strategic. Now, some of this we do already just as people who research and use Google, but there are ways in which you can be more intentional about this. And then I'm just going to keep checking in with you, Heather, to make sure, if I forgot something or if there's something you want to add.
Not at the moment. I was still trying to troubleshoot something in the chat.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for doing that. Okay, cool. So that's just it. This is the framework from which we're going to be approaching our searches from now on. Now, our second tip is going to be engage with the source, not just the link. What do I mean by that? Well, when we look online, obviously, there are a lot of different sources of information. And when they come on the screen, it looks like a website. We see this a lot when we help students create citations. When you create a citation, even using a citation generator, you need to really take a moment and look at what the source is instead of just thinking of it as a website. A lot of websites are published from specific people. They have specific purposes, and being able to find a credible website, a credible resource for your assignment, really comes down to understanding those different source types. So before I even am going to dig into my example search, I want to take a moment to discuss the different type of sources that we find online. A lot of the things that you see online end up being, especially when you're searching for like a college assignment, I think, given the topics and the nature of what you're looking for, tend to be something like a newspaper or a magazine article. And there's so many different kinds of those. And there are some that are more credible and there are some that are not as credible. But it's important to keep in mind while we're looking online that newspapers tend to be shorter, generally speaking. They tend to be created at the time of the event or something occurring. Magazines tend to be a little bit more in depth. They have the possibility to be a little bit more in depth. There is potentially a little bit more research involved with it. So when I'm looking for information that has happened kind of like at the time of the event, something like a newspaper and a magazine article can be really helpful. We also have different sources that are called trade publications. So this is the type of information that's created by someone like in that career. So we're librarians. There are a bunch of different websites, resources associated with libraries and being librarians. And that's going to have a different type of information than just a general website for the public, right? It's geared for people in those areas. And these can be particularly helpful depending on your subject area and the purpose of your assignment, because they have a little bit more of that credibility depending on the perspective of what you're looking for. And I think we don't think of them as often. There are scholarly journals, which I am going to encourage you to go to our scholarly Google workshop next week. We'll go into that more detail, searching for scholarly articles using Google more specifically. But these are written by experts. They go through the peer review process, and there's certainly something that you can access online, but usually you need to go behind a paywall to access this type of content. And then, of course, we have books. I mean, you can use our resources of the library, like the Spokane Public Library, to access books. But I'm going to move on to reference materials. So this is where something like Wikipedia, when Heather mentioned that doing more like background information can be really helpful for you. Maybe it won't be in your final bibliography, your final like paper, but this is a great opportunity to get familiar with your topic. And I would say that this is one of the very like number one things I would use Google for. Getting those search terms, understanding who's involved. Google is perfect for that. And then we have government documents. So these are going to be things created by the government, published online. You tend to see a lot of like statistics, data, reports, which actually comes up a lot when we help students research. So I think when we think data and stats, we don't necessarily think like government. I mean, there's like the census and all that, but they make so much more information.
And then also, I was going to say the government documents are also if you need to cite like a law or a statute, because sometimes you may be researching something that involves some type of actual statute or code at the local, national, or federal level. And so government documents are where we would go.
Yes, that comes up a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, we have resources like television, podcasts. I'm a big podcast person, so I get a lot of information from that online and listening. And then, of course, we have websites in general. But honestly, everything we've been talking about so far is a website. So that's what I'm referring to when I say understanding source material. These come up as websites, but they're actually a different source, each one of them. They have different information and a different purpose. And it can kind of get messy looking online, determining what that is. But that is not just your first step in like knowing how to Google well, but also how to assess something for credibility.
And to go along with this, understanding some source types not only helps you, as we said, with determining credibility, it also helps you when you ultimately have to cite your sources, because you're going to need to know your source type in order to cite your source, which once again is a workshop a little bit later on. And Shardy, I'm just going to throw in sort of a little analogy here for Google and source types. I kind of think of it like if I'm watching a show on like Netflix. Let's say I have Netflix on, and I found a show. It doesn't mean that everything I'm watching on there is Netflix. I could be watching a TV show on Netflix. I could be watching a documentary on Netflix. I could be watching a movie on Netflix. It doesn't mean everything is Netflix. There's different types of, films, television shows, documentaries I can be watching via Netflix. So that's kind of the way Google is. There's lots of different source types. You just happen to be viewing them via Google.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I love that example. So I am just doing my basic first search here. I am interested in psychology of con artists. More or less a question kind of that I would ask Google. And as I look at my search results, of course, I'm going to be looking at the title. I think usually that's what I look at first as a searcher. But when we're talking about looking at source types, I want you to look at the little description ahead of it that's telling us where that information is coming from, who published it. So that's where we're looking at source types. And doing that up front, just off of this page, is going to help me narrow in on not only sources that are helpful. Of course, I want you to look at the title, the descriptions, click on kind of what matches that question. But this is also telling me where the information is coming from. So Psychology Today is familiar to me. What we're familiar with will be different by who we are and what we're exposed to. I know that this is something that isn't necessarily a scholarly journal, but it is something that, has some research involved in it. This is something that probably I think my professor would think is credible because we know who's publishing it. It's a big name. Of course, you want to evaluate it for that various information, but I'm already narrowing on sources that might be more credible than others. As I scroll through here, look at the different places that publish. I'm not going to be familiar with all of these, but I can recognize CNBC as a news source. We can see that it's actually lumping together these by different sources for me. So here, source type and image is a version of a source type. Books are another source type. So here I could look at what books are available and be like, oh, that sounds interesting. I'm going to see if the SFCC library has it. I'm going to see if the Spokane Public Library has it. Sometimes I think we think books are intimidating, but really you just need to use a section of a book. You don't need to use the entire book. So that's another source that I think maybe we discount, but I can take this and using that as a jumping off platform. I can also see here that I have a source coming from NPR, which obviously is very familiar for me. I know that that maybe might be a little bit more credible considering that it's something that we view as maybe having like a little less bias. It's a news source that definitely goes through that process of like vetting that information. But of course, I need to vet that individual source. So notice as I'm looking at my different examples here, I'm not just looking at the title or the description, I'm looking at the source itself to help me make the decision about what to click on and what not to click on. And I know you guys might go through this process naturally, which is awesome, but this is just an example of what I'm talking about when I'm saying being intentional in how you search and what you're looking for.
To add on to that, one of the results that Sade had on that screen was from Quora.com, Quora. And I don't know about everybody else, but I know that that's one of those places I go, maybe if I have a personal question, right? I'm trying to fix something in my house that's broken. I might go there to see what other people have answered because it's more a question board where everybody can, like anybody can answer the question, which is great if I'm just trying to figure out how to DIY something, but not necessarily someplace I'd probably go for my academic research. So once again, I would not click on that one. I would probably bypass that one as I'm looking at the different sources available to me.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. And now this leads us to tip number 3, and this is information gather, do multiple searches. And again, this is something that maybe we might do intuitively, but I'm saying when we're researching, especially for something like a college assignment, that we do this intentionally. And that might mean taking out a piece of paper and writing down the different terms that I saw in that first search that I thought were interesting. You might also notice that my search was very broad. Psychology of con artists is a really big idea. And typically when you have to write a paper or do a presentation, you're required to have something like a thesis statement. You need to have focus within what you're researching. And that is too big of a topic. I'm just going to throw that out there. Too big. I need to narrow in. So I've made a list of the various terms, ideas that I thought might be helpful from my previous just generic search. And now I might search those ideas individually, but I'm definitely going to pull from the language that I found in that initial search. So in this instance, I really thought that like the term psychological principles, that's not something I was going to think of on my own, sounded really helpful. Like, I think that's kind of the concept I might be really interested in when I think psychology of con artists. And there's a lot here. Like, do I want to focus on the victims? Do I want to focus on the con artists themselves? Like, that changes the perspective of what I'm looking for. And then I also found that there are so many words to describe con artist or a con. Grifter, hustler, scammer, fraud, scam. These are all terms that are going to get me different results. And so I've taken the time to actually write these down. Heather, do you want to talk about incognito mode real quick?
Sure. So I actually did notice that when Sade did her initial results or her search here, and I don't know if it'll come up on these results, but one of the things had said, you visited this website twice. Now, honestly, I don't ever remember seeing that before until I was just looking at our results when Sade presented them. But this kind of reminds me that a lot of times Google knows who we are. Like perhaps, you have signed in because you have a Gmail account or something like that. But Google has started to memorize and started to figure out what you like to click on, what your interests are. And so they start to personalize your results. So what you'll start to notice, what you may notice is that, I noticed that a lot of this website comes up to the top because Google's starting to understand that I always click on that. Or maybe they'll say they're always giving me results for Spokane first because it knows that I'm located in Spokane. So if whatever my research need has sort of a regional focus, it might do that. Well, that's great when I'm doing personal research and I want to find out hey, what's the local movie time, here in Spokane. But I wanted to point out that can also be sort of a hindrance when we're doing academic research, because in academic research, you want to get an idea of a variety of sources, a variety of perspectives, not just what Google thinks I might want to know or might be most interesting to me. I really want to keep an open mind when I'm doing academic research. So I want to remove that personalization from Google. And one of the ways you can do that is in the, if you're in Chrome or, Firefox or something, there's 3 little buttons in the top right-hand corner next to sort of like maybe your face or something. And you'll see an option for new incognito window. And you'll notice it gives you a shortcut. You can also use Control-Shift-N if you're on a Windows device. If you're on a Mac, it's Command-Shift-N. And that will open up, sometimes it'll be like a black background or something. I don't know if Sade can click on an incognito window just to see how it kind of slightly changes what the page looks like. So in Chrome, it tends to give you a black background and it says you've gone incognito where, we've erased your browsing history, your cookies, your data. And so it's kind of pretending it doesn't know anything about you. So now if I do a search, I may get some slightly different results. I won't get that same personalization. So this is really helpful when doing academic research because you're pulling yourself out of that, confirmation bubble or personalization bubble.
Oh, thank you, Heather. All right, so I've taken those terms that I wrote down and I've revised my search a little bit. So now I'm including the term psychological principles related to victims of cyber crime artists. So you can see here, I'm getting a little bit more specific. I'm finding focus within my search, and that's going to change the type of resources I'm getting. Now, I want to point out that we can see here we're getting something from the BBC. So again, I'm looking at that source type. Of course, you still have to click on the resources to see if that information is relevant to you or not. But I do think we can see the type of source changing here. So just because I'm a librarian, I know Springer probably is an article from like a scholarly journal. Yeah, it is. Now, if you find something like this, which we would call a scholarly journal, you should never pay for it. There are ways to get access. You can do what we call an interlibrary loan. So if you're Googling and find something like a scholarly article that requires access, go to the library website and then look for a section that says interlibrary loan. There's a lot more detail of what goes into this, so I do recommend you go to the workshop next week. on scholarly articles, but know that we can see the content of change based off of my language, psychological principles. So I'm not just asking a question of Google. Know that Google searches based off of the language that you're using and where it's searching for those terms. So just by changing my turn of phrase or the words I'm using to search, I can see the type of sources I'm getting have changed a little bit too. So I'm getting things from the BBC, some scholarly information. Here I am getting a website that looks like it's from the government. So again, when I'm thinking of like options for credibility of information, like I'm getting some things here that I think might be a little bit more feasible from that perspective. I'm not going to click on each individual thing because I want to make sure we get through all of our next steps. But do know that that's part of what I'm looking at when I'm looking at the source type here. So I can tell by just using a different type of language, my source types are changing and the information I'm getting is changing as well.
And also notice when you're reading these results, like underneath, it'll tell you sometimes if they've removed a search term. Because they're like, hey, maybe all these other things match up with the other search terms you have. But that top result says, oh, we didn't include the word cyber. You're not going to find the word cyber in this particular article. Sometimes that may not be a big deal, but sometimes that may be a big deal to you. And notice you can say, nope, it has to include cyber and change your Google results.
And we'll show you how to do that using the Google Advanced Search. All right, tip number 4 is to understand how Google search works, at least the basics of it. So I think this video does it better than I could. I'll admit the video is a little older, but I think it explains it in the way that I like best. This is my best explanation of it. And I don't know, maybe you've seen part of this video before or not, but I do think it's very relevant to the next section of what we're going to do. So we're just going to watch the first 2 minutes of this video. And what I hope you get from this is an understanding of how Google is going about getting those results for you and how you can leverage that as a researcher. So let's go ahead and watch just the first part of this video. And hopefully I have the option on where you can hear. So let me know if you have any issues.
And can you click on closed captioning on that?
My name is Matt Cutts. I'm an engineer in the quality group at Google, and I'd like to talk today about what happens when you do a web search. The first thing to understand is that when you do a Google search, you aren't actually searching the web. You're searching Google's index of the web, or at least as much of it as we can find. We do this with software programs called spiders. Spiders start by fetching a few web pages. Then they follow the links on those pages and fetch the pages they point to, and follow all the links on those pages and fetch the pages they link to, and so on, until we've indexed a pretty big chunk of the web, many billions of pages stored across thousands of machines. Now, suppose I want to know how fast a cheetah can run. I type in my search, say cheetah, running, speed, and hit return. Our software searches our index to find every page that includes those search terms. In this case, there are hundreds of thousands of possible results. How does Google decide which few documents I really want? By asking questions, more than 200 of them, like, how many times does this page contain your keywords? Do the words appear in the title? In the URL? Directly adjacent? Does the page include synonyms for those words? Is this page from a quality website, or is it low quality, even spammy? What is this page's page rank? That's a formula invented by our founders, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, that rates a web page's importance by looking at how many outside links point to it and how important those links are. Finally, we combine all those factors together to produce each page's overall score and send you back your search results about half a second after you submit your search. At Google, we take our...
Okay, so that's the basic part of what I'm hoping you would get from that video. But what I want you to take from it is how that search function works and where they're looking to get those results. And I'm going to tie this in a couple more of the examples. But notice how we're looking at where your search term appears in the title. How many times does it appear in the text? How many times does it linked to other web pages. And the importance of this that I really want you to take away is that your language really matters when you search in something like a Google. We talk about it a lot when we talk about searching in something like a library database, but I think we think Google interprets us, which it does. It's much better at that than something like a library database. But given the example I showed before, even just using that term psychological principles changed the type of resources that I was getting. So as you search, be aware of what affects the results that you're getting. Heather, is there anything that you want to add? I'm also going to pause and see if anybody has any questions or thoughts that they want to throw out there so far. Gonna give us a little bit of a pause. So let's talk about Google Advanced Search. And this is tip number 5 for hopefully all of us who are keeping track. Google Advanced Search, I'll show you how to navigate to this page. Let's see. There we go. You can always just Google Advanced Search and it'll bring the link right up to the top. That's typically what I do. If you want, I've put the link at the very top here. But you're going to see that this page looks very different compared to just the Google box that you use most of the time, 95% of the time. And you can see that this actually looks very similar if you've ever used a library database before, where you have the different boxes and the many different filter options. It gives you a lot more control over your search. And we're going to apply some of those principles that we mentioned in the video about like targeting where these words are used, how are we searching, applying filters to our Google search that gives us a little bit more control over our search. And there are some strategies that we can apply to this that will make this process more effective for us as well. One of these strategies is using quotations. And so we talk about this a lot if ever you've had a librarian come to your class, assist you with research. It's also called phrase searching. So this is this concept that the examples I have on the screen here, if I search for a term like con artist, I certainly am going to get good results back. But if I put quotations around con artist, it makes it so that my search is searched for as a phrase or one idea. The way that Google searches without those quotes is that it might find con in one area, artist in the other. I'm definitely going to get helpful results, but at the same time, if I use these quotes, I'm being more specific with Google, and it's going to hopefully give back more relevant results because I'm telling it that this is one phrase or one concept. And like I said, this is something that we see in library databases very often, but all those a lot of the strategies that you use to search in a library database apply in Google as well. We just don't always use them.
And as Sade says this, please remember that this is when you're using very specific phrases. You don't she wouldn't want to put it around psychological principles of con artists because that's not necessarily like a very common way of describing that, but she would put it around con artists because that's exactly how you would describe someone and use that phraseology.
Yes, thank you. So like a noun or one idea, we're not going to put around like questions or statements. As Heather said, that will make it harder for you. All right, so this is where we get into kind of like the nitty gritty of like some like actual examples. And so for our boxes here, we want to pay attention to what each one of these boxes represent and how we search. So all of these words means that I want all of these terms incorporated in the results I get. So it's going to narrow my search results because I'm being very specific about the language that I want and how Google searches.
And that's typically what the single box in Google, when you usually go to google.com, that single box is all these words. That's what it defaults to.
Yeah, thank you. This exact word or phrase. So this is, I mean, you can use the quotes throughout any of these examples, but if you did have a phrase, this is definitely where you want to use the quotes to come up with that one thought or one idea. Any of these words means, we're casting a little bit of a wider net here to be able to get search results back. And then we have none of these words, which means I don't want, like, this is related to this topic, but I don't want it. My basic example for this is like, you're looking for like baseball bats, or you're looking for like the creature bat, and you keep getting results about like baseball bats. You can say, no, I want this one and not the other. And I'll show you what that looks like in an example in just a moment. So let's start just with an example of the terms or phrases that I've pulled as I've gone along, as I've been searching. And sometimes you can overwhelm Google even. So let's just do a basic search as if I was searching in the big box. So here we go. So you can see here, I put in the and capitalized, like it's what we call Boolean searching. You're required to do this in something like a library database, and I do that like automatically. But when you're searching in something like Google, it puts the and in there for you. So I can include these or I can take these out, but I'm keeping with the basic ideas here of what I'm searching for. So instead of asking Google a question, I'm really focusing on just the basic search terms that I want to use. And you'll notice that I've put quotations around cyber scam and psychological principle because I want it to think about it as one concept or one phrase. I'm going to go ahead and hit search. So we can see here that it's pulling results. There's not a ton here, though. This is what I'm talking about when I said you could like overwhelm even Google. So this isn't working for me as well. So let's experiment with this a little bit. So let's instead take these terms and put that in any of these. So in this first example here, I'm telling it, no, I only want results that have all three of these, no exceptions. But with using this option of any of these words, I'm casting out a wider net. So we can see here, I went from 0 results to many, many results. And the way that this Google Advanced Search works, you can see is that they're applying what we call these Boolean operators automatically. And so it's telling the database that I want victim or cyber scam or psychological principles. So I'm not necessarily finding all these things in one spot. Instead, it's finding any website that has any of these terms on it. So this is a very wide net I have cast out there. So if I go back to that advanced search feature, I'm going to experiment with this a little bit more to get something that's going to be more helpful for me. So in this instance, I might do something like, sorry, I'm looking at my notes as I go along, looking at my notes and talking. Mm-hmm. So here, any of these, I'm looking for either cyber scam. I want results that say cyber scam, or I'm willing to accept results that are also online fraud, right? It's a different way of describing the same idea. And I want any result that had either of those terms involved. However, I want to make sure that for sure that it includes a specific concept. So maybe I do want to make sure that psychology is involved. So either one of these will do, but I definitely want the term psychology. And I want to focus, I always, like I said, I always include the Boolean operator. You don't have to in Google because it does it for you automatically, but it's called a Boolean operator here. Oh, Heather just put it in the chat box for you. Basically, a Boolean operator describes the relationship between these concepts. So I'm going to hit the search button and it'll make a little bit more sense when you see it on the screen. Just one moment. But basically what I'm telling Google at the moment is that all these words, so that these are my must-have words, it has to have the words psychology and victim, my results. But it could have any of the words cyber scam or online fraud. Either one of those would do. I'm not too picky about those. They're describing the same thing.
And I want to interject here just for one moment. Notice that Sade put quotation marks around cyber scam. And some of you may be wondering, well, why didn't she put that in the second box that says this exact word or phrase? Because we talked about how that's also where you use quotation marks. But in this instance, if she had put it in the second box, it would say that that phrase has to appear. And in this instance, Sade says, no, it could be cyber scam or online fraud. So she put it in that any of these words. If she had put both of those terms in the exact word, in that second box for exact word, it would have looked for both of those phrases.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Heather. And, this requires practice. This is the way that library databases work as well. Part of the reason why we might get more relevant results or results that, are a little bit more specific is because we're telling it so specifically what we want. And I know that it takes some practice using something like this, but if you use it over time, I think the results you get, it can really change the way you search something like Google. So I'm sorry, I feel like I kind of went over the Boolean operator aspect of it really quickly, which I didn't mean to do, because sometimes that can be a little tricky to use. But let's see our search results. So we can see here at the top, this is kind of telling us what we're searching for. So it's looking for the term psychology, either in that title, the text, how many times it appears. We're looking for the word victim, and we're looking for cyber scam or online fraud. So it's looking for either one of those terms. And instead of just asking a question of Google, now I have more control of that search, right? I'm adding multiple layers so that I only have to do, one search that does many things. And again, we want to look at the source types, all the things that we've talked about earlier about looking where the sources are coming from. I'm pulling some scholarly articles, The Guardian, a little long format, magazine publications. I'm pulling from government websites. So here you can see that the type of information I'm pulling has changed just based off of the words that I've used and my establishing kind of the relationships between those words. I feel like that was kind of a lot. I'm going to pause. Do you guys have any questions? Am I making sense so far? If yeah, you can give a thumbs up, or if you're like, I'm okay with the thumbs down. I mostly want this to be helpful. So if it's not making sense, yep. Okay. I got a yep.
All right.
Okay, sweet. So I just am going to recommend go to Google Advanced Search and experiment with this. Now let's discuss, I forgot there's one last thing I wanted to show. So the none of these options. So let's say when I was making a list of different terms, researching what I might be interested in, I noticed that romance scam came up a lot. And you know what? I don't want to focus on that in my paper. That's not something that I'm interested in. This is where you will apply something like none of these. So when I say none of these, you'll see at my results at the little top here, it says there's a minus and then that word or concept. So now none of these results are in theory going to mention romance scams. Instead, I'm going to be focusing on different types of scams. So that's one way in which I can not have to go through results that have a concept that I don't want to focus on. That's when you would use something like the none of these search option. Okay. Is there anything you want to add, Heather? I feel like that's
actually, Mary just had a suggestion. In order to get to the Google Advanced page, I know that we said we can Google Advanced page. But another option, I don't know, Sade, if you can pull up just a Google results page for me, so we can show them how to actually get to advanced search. So if you've done a search in Google, if you go over to that little gear up in the top right-hand corner and click on it, that is also another place that you can find advanced search. You'll see it right there. So, once again, you kind of have to do a search in order to get that gear to pop up so that you can then click on advanced search. So either Google Advanced Search, or you can use the gear.
And then there's another feature of Google Advanced Search, and this focuses on the type of source again that you're going to be pulling from. Now, A domain is that little like .com, .edu, .gov at the end of a website that says who's publishing that information. So .com is most common, just means more or less regular website, commercial website. .edu means that it's coming from an educational source. However, no, this could be sometimes like people like post like grade school work at a .edu. So don't think because it's a .edu, it's automatically very credible. You still have to evaluate it. But you are going to get things like reports, informations from like college websites, that type of stuff. So it changes again with that credibility conversation, as well as, you know, who's publishing it. .gov is government websites, and then .org are nonprofit websites. Please know that anyone can publish a nonprofit website. So again, evaluate. But the nice thing about nonprofit websites is that they tend to collect like reports, statistics. If you're looking for like data of some kind, I usually recommend you go to Google and narrow down your searches to a .org, because that's where that information lives. Like I know there's been quite a few assignments recently about like homelessness, and especially if you want to look at like that area, that concept, to research it like from a local capacity, local nonprofit organizations are where that information is going to live. So narrowing down your search to that type of website is really helpful. So let's take a look at what that looks like using the Google Advanced Search.
And as Shardae's pulling this up, just remember, I just want to reiterate that just because something has a domain like a .com or a .org, you can't just automatically say, oh, that's a great site or that's a bad site, because you can find useful information on any domain, just like you can find really bad information on any domain.
Even when you're using scholarly papers.
Yes.
All right, so I'm just going to repeat the search that I did before. So these boxes above still apply. If I scroll down to this section, notice that there's all sorts of stuff you can specify: the language, the region, the time in which it was published online. Honestly, the one that I tend to use the most is the domain. So here I can specify that I only want .edu. So I'm only going to get resources coming from educational websites. So you can see here, that's changed the types of search results I'm getting. So some of these will be like websites published by the university themselves. You might get, oh, this could be helpful. This is a report, it looks like, that was maybe published. So definitely could be a helpful source. You might also get references to scholarly articles you might have to track down, but this is definitely going to change my ability to access and easily discern what might be a helpful source. So for this particular example we're using, earlier when I was searching, I realized that like there's a lot of government websites about this information. So I might narrow in on government websites. And so this is where we kind of get into the nuance of different source types. So something from a government site for the topic that I'm looking for today, it looks like there's a lot of like, you know, how not to fall for crime or for cybercrime. I'm curious what's out there, what reports different government entities have put out there. I might use something like .edu or a scholarly article to look at like how people have studied this concept. I might use a newspaper or magazine source to give examples of like what people have like been exposed to or fallen for some to this point. So you can see that by focusing on these different source types and kind of being intentional, going back to our tip number 1, I'm getting all different sources that I can examine in different ways and use for my research paper. So know that by narrowing in and using those different like domain features, I'm being really intentional, again, with what I'm targeting online. Also, like I said, with the .org, this might be a great instance where I need like, I want statistics or data about like fraud or cybercrime in the United States. Probably going to be somewhere on a government website or a nonprofit website. So you can see here how I've evolved my search from that just very general psychology of con artists. And now I have a real focus and I have different source types that I'm going to be able to utilize in different ways as I give my presentation, as I write my paper. So things have become a little bit more nuanced along that process. And then we're almost coming to the end here. So I do just want to point out one last feature, and that is the file type option.
Oh, wait, can I just, before you move on to file type, Sharday was just talking about how you could limit it to a specific domain, like a .gov or a .edu, but you can also limit it to a particular site. So even if I was I was searching government sites and I said, well, actually, you know what? I really only want to look at like the Department of Justice government sites. I can write in that same box where she wrote domain, I could put justice.gov and it would only search the Department of Justice website. It would only search that website. This can be super helpful, I find, when I'm searching newspapers, because I don't necessarily always like the search engine that's available on a newspaper, be it the like New York Times website or something like that. I can say, just search this site and drop in inlander.com, newyorktimes.com, something like that, and it will only search that website.
Yeah, thank you. Great tip. Thank you, Heather. And then, so the other feature here that I want to point out, I honestly probably use this the most for PDFs, because you're going to find, like I said, reports come up a lot when searching, especially doing research for academic purposes. So if I click PDF here under file type, it will only bring up resources that are a PDF. So again, I'm going to have to go through these different resources, read their descriptions, see where this information is coming from. Is it credible? But if you can find a good report for something, which usually lives in a PDF, this is one way to intentionally focus on that. And same can be said of, and I use this more often, like from a work perspective, but you can also do it for something like a PowerPoint, which I've used in the past as well. Okay, so we're coming to the end of our workshop. So I do want to review real quick for those of us who are keeping track and know that there's an assessment portion at the end.
Remember, that's how you get your extra credit. Fill out the assessment form, and then we'll tell your teachers that you were here.
So these are the different tips that we've covered in the workshop. So one is stopping and strategizing, being intentional about what we're looking for. Two, engaging with the source, not just the link, which is helpful for determining credibility as well as creating citations. So if we do this up front, it makes those other process we come to the end a little easier because we've already put in the work a little bit as we've gone through our search process. Tip number 3, information gathering. So this is where we might have to do multiple searches. Also, we're keeping track of the different terms and language that we're using. Going back to that first example, just by using a certain phrase, my types of sources changed. So know that Google, yes, is looking for an answer to your question, but also it is very intentionally based off of that video we watched, looking at the language and how often it appears in certain parts of the website. So the language we use, very important, which basically leads us to our tip number 4. And then tip number 5 being experimenting with an advanced Google search. Use the quotations to very specifically say, no, I'm looking for this as a phrase or one idea. Use the different search boxes and experiment with them so that you get more specific search results. And then also, of course, we have those options at the bottom where it helps us narrow in again on source type. So when we search online, as I'm talking, I'm realizing a big part of this conversation is the source itself, the source type, engaging with this concept of source versus just a website. Okay, so does anybody have any questions? And you can do a thumbs up if you're just like, I get it. Thank you very much. We're doing good.